The introduction of Oberyn Martell and the subplot that integrated Dorne and the Sand Snakes into A Song of Ice and Fire is understandably and undeniably a fan-favorite aspect of the books, as well as one of the most reviled story collapses in Game of Thrones. However, a great deal of the tragedy of the story of Oberyn and his daughters is often missed, despite the fact that it is an incredibly moving facet of the story itself. The generation of the families of great houses that lived through Robert's Rebellion were all dramatically and oftentimes catastrophically affected by the Civil War and the collapse of House Targaryen. But House Martell's experience throughout this era was left almost completely unacknowledged until Oberyn was introduced into the narrative and radically changed the landscape of the overall story. Oberyn is one of the best characters in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones in his own right. But he added a great deal of dimension to the already established dynamics of other families like the Targaryens, Starks, and Lannisters, and he managed to bring many aspects of his dead sister Elia back to life in the eyes of the audience. And, while the Red Viper was a power player in the contemporary world of Westeros, every inch of his characterization was colored by Elia, and the trauma of her loss indisputably altered him, his daughters, and all of House Martell. Elia Martell is one of the most underappreciated characters in the world of Ice and Fire. While she doesn't even exist within the current storyline, in the eyes of many both in and outside of the universe, she is nothing more than a supporting player in the saga of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. The interpretations of her character can vary pretty wildly, but the perception of her as a supporter of Rhaegar and Lyanna's supposed quest to manifest the Chosen One in Jon Snow is bizarrely and inexplicably common, and it completely ignores Elia's value and importance as an individual. But the introduction of Oberyn brings the reality of Elia into sharp relief and allows the audience to see her as a fully formed human in her own right, rather than nothing more than Rhaegar Targaryen's helpmeet. Oberyn's fiery outrage at what happened to Elia seems to be demonstration enough that she likely would not have been okay with anything that happened to her. But the fact that Oberyn himself has such undying love for his dead sister is a powerful illustration of what kind of people Elia, Oberyn, and all of the Martells really are. And there is a lot of unexamined subtextual tragedy to the relationship between Elia and Oberyn, and how it informed Oberyn as a character going forward. The Martells in general are fascinating characters that oftentimes serve as mirrors or foils to the Starks. And one of the most obvious examples of this is the way in which Oberyn's love for Elia both matches and contrasts with Ned's mourning of Lyanna. Oberyn and Ned are both second sons who are completely and radically changed by the death of their sisters. But interestingly, their reactions to these huge losses are completely different. While Ned does everything he can to ignore the realities of Lyanna's death and seemingly rationalizes away a lot of the fault that lies with people like Robert or Rhaegar, Oberyn is absolutely ablaze with outrage at the injustice that killed Elia and has built his life around revenge for her loss. But an even more interesting and relevant foil dynamic between Ned and Oberyn is the way in which they treat their children. Ned is traumatized by Lyanna's death and does everything he can to shelter his children from the horrors of the world. But Oberyn collects all of his daughters, sometimes to their own detriment or the detriment of their mothers, and builds them into some of the most ferocious warriors in Westeros. Oberyn Martell is one of the most idealized characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, but one ugly element of his characterization that almost everyone seems to ignore is the fact that, while he clearly loves his daughters, he often does so in an incredibly toxic way. The first and most obvious example of this is the very fact that he has his daughters at all, as his custody of his 4 oldest children is a result of him taking them from their mothers, likely against their will in at least some cases. And one could probably make the argument that a Prince of Dorne could offer these girls a better life than almost anyone else. But the probability that all 4 of these girls' mothers were willing to have Oberyn take them away and seemingly never see them again is very, very low. In fact, the mother of Obara, Oberyn's oldest daughter, apparently drank herself to death within a year of losing Obara. So clearly Oberyn's girl dad vibes have gone way too far. However, within the context of Elia, it's not all that surprising either. Despite Oberyn and Elia's close relationship, the pair couldn't seem more dissimilar. Oberyn was a ferocious fighter, but Elia was chronically ill and remained bedridden for half a year after giving birth to Rhaenys, while the birth of Aegon almost killed her. And this contrast adds a layer of tragedy to Elia's loss that seems like it absolutely must inform the way in which Oberyn raised his daughters. Clearly, Elia was never in a state where she could have become the kind of girl or woman that the Sand Snakes are, because she had been sick and weak for her entire life as a result of being born prematurely. And in retrospect, this must have been difficult for Oberyn to bear on a multitude of levels. Elia was certainly trapped in King's Landing and served as a hostage of the Mad King Aerys. But given her poor health after childbirth, it's debatable whether or not she could have escaped even if she wanted to. This alone must have been internally infuriating to Oberyn, as he was literally one of the strongest warriors on the planet. But in this circumstance, he couldn't fight for someone he loved more than anything. Being that strong and that capable, but being incapable of fighting for his sister simply due to circumstance and literal physical distance must have been a catastrophically damaging experience for Oberyn. And the thought of his weak sister actually standing up and pointlessly trying to fight someone as strong as the Mountain in defense of her own children and then losing that fight in the most horrific way imaginable undoubtedly informed every choice that Oberyn made when it came to raising his own children. Through the lens of Elia's death, nearly every aspect of the dynamic between the Red Viper and Sand Snakes is explained. Keeping them in his custody, even if it traumatizes them or their mothers, makes sense with the context of his inability to actually get to Elia and defend her when it mattered. Having bastards and raising them to liberally go after whatever they choose, ironically protected them from the true-born fate that seemingly doomed Elia to a loveless marriage that got her and her children killed. And raising them to be survivors no matter the circumstance at least theoretically meant that even if Oberyn was gone, he would never have to worry about them being unable to protect themselves. But, as with every other traumatized parent who raised children in the world of Ice and Fire, the warped but good intentions that Oberyn had when raising the Sand Snakes had unplanned consequences that could lend to future tragedy. Oberyn raised his daughters to be loving and loyal to their family, and he taught them how to survive in a world that would likely brutalize them someday. But the most dangerous lesson that he taught them without even trying to is that vengeance is worth dying for. Ironically, the Red Viper raised the Sand Snakes so that he would never have to worry about their safety, so that they would never become another Elia. But he completely disregarded the danger of them becoming another him. As he himself demonstrated, unabated fury plus a talent for killing people is an incredibly perilous combination where the righteous warrior doesn't necessarily emerge as the victor. The old saying goes, before you set out on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. But Oberyn Martell may have inadvertently dug 10. While he likely raised all of his children in the hopes that they could survive any situation, he almost certainly didn't recognize that his willingness to risk his own life in order to avenge Elia might have the same exact effect on his daughters and their willingness to risk it all to fight for him. Inherited violence is obviously a huge overarching theme within A Song of Ice and Fire, but this instance might just be the most heartbreaking because it was the well-intended result of emotional devastation and the loss of genuine love. And if the Sand Snakes actually do follow in their father's footsteps and make the dead more important than the living, then it seems extremely unlikely that they'll all survive to the end of the novel series. Understandably, the fact that their father died attempting to right the wrongs that were done to Elia, and the people who actually committed those wrongs largely got away with it, has driven the Sand Snakes towards an extreme desire to avenge their father and their aunt. And unfortunately, few people in the world are more equipped to exact that revenge than they are. But the likelihood that they will be able to enact that vengeance and come away unscathed is pretty low. Clearly, the fate of the Sand Snakes in Game of Thrones doesn't offer anything encouraging when it comes to their future in A Song of Ice and Fire either. However, while the possibility of all the Sand Snakes dying violent deaths because of their desire for revenge isn't hard to believe given their current circumstances in the books, thankfully, their futures might be a tad brighter than what Game of Thrones portrayed. The Sand Snakes, the Martells, and the entire region of Dorne seems to be so radically different in the books and the TV series that it's pretty reasonable to almost completely disregard what happened in the show as a potential predictor of what will happen for them in the books. Their characterizations and familial dynamic are comparatively totally unrecognizable. But there is one interesting facet of the story that could offer the Sands and the Martells the opportunity to build a better future. Thankfully, both Ellaria Sand and Oberyn Martell are far more cautious, thoughtful, and caring characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. Oberyn was willing to risk his own life to avenge his sister, but the people around him seem to counterbalance that unabated rage in a way that could bring at least some of the sand snakes back from the brink. However, one potential avenue of true redress that Oberyn tragically missed the chance for seems to be coming in the form of young Griff. The truth of young Griff's parentage I personally think is more debatable than many others seem to believe. But one thing that seems like a near guarantee is that whether or not he is Elia Martell's real long-lost son, most of the world will actually believe that he is. One of the great tragedies of Elia and Oberyn is that Oberyn died believing that revenge was the only thing that he had left to offer his sister. However, whether young Griff is the real Aegon Targaryen or not, the prior story seems to imply that most of Westeros, including the Martells, will sincerely believe that he is the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Elia Martell. This presents interesting possibilities for the Sand Snakes, because it presents another possibility at all. Before the introduction of young Griff, all they really had was a dead father who didn't entirely get the justice he desired for his dead sister. But if Oberyn's daughters have to choose between punishing those that they believe are guilty, or putting their cousin on the Iron Throne, then it'll be interesting to see what path they go down. Overall, it seems likely that the introduction of young Griff and Daenerys' invasion of Westeros might galvanize them in a way that enables them to survive beyond a dream of spring. Or it might at least mean that they die in service of helping the living rather than avenging the dead. Given their connection with young Griff as well as their ancient cultural rivalry with the Valyrians and dragon invaders, it would come as little surprise if they were actually key players in resisting Dany's invasion. And, considering that their mother is a bastard of House Uller, the house that killed Rhaenys and Meraxes during Aegon's conquest, it seems probable that even if Game of Thrones' metaphorical and literal massacre of the Sand Snakes was based on any kind of book canon, they're at the very least not going to go down fighting Euron Greyjoy in Daenerys' name. But in order for this to happen, these girls are going to have to outgrow their father. Oberyn Martell may have loved his daughters ferociously, but he also loved them toxically. And like nearly every parent in the world of Ice and Fire, in his desire to save them from the horrors that he or his loved ones experienced, he largely set them up for future failure. As we've seen with the Starks, families who seem to genuinely love each other oftentimes suffer horrifically for it, but they also tend to rally in the end. And ironically, although Oberyn Martell seemingly obsessively prepared his children to survive whatever life threw at them, their best chance at survival likely lies in discovering how to move beyond the grief that defined him. But what do you think? Will the Sand Snakes survive to the end of A Song of Ice and Fire? Or are they doomed? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.